The following program is a co-production of Seattle Channel and Seattle City Club and sponsored by Comcast.
Considering the instability around the world, how secure are we as a nation?
On a given month, it's highly unlikely that our naval or air forces will run into anyone who's even remotely a peer group competitor.
And new energy, new ideas, as the Seattle City Council welcomes 4 new members.
Police presence alone is not going to fix a lot of the systemic issues that are happening in the Pike Pine corridor.
This has been an issue in the downtown area of Seattle for decades.
Yes, I do believe that there is a problem where we're not prosecuting like we should.
What do you think about the First Avenue streetcar?
I have so many thoughts and feelings about it.
It's all coming up on Civic Cocktail.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to February Civic Cocktail. I'm Joni Balter, and we have a great show tonight. First up, 4-star General Barry McCaffrey, a former cabinet advisor to President Clinton. He currently serves as national security and terrorism analyst for NBC News. He has 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 3 Purple Hearts. Our journalists this evening, tonight, Chris Daniels from King 5 and Amy Radel from KUOW. Thank you both so much. I couldn't do it without you. Thanks for being here. So, General McCaffrey, welcome. I want to start with something that I found surprising. You prepared some notes for this evening, and the first item on these notes was that the U.S. has never been more secure in modern times. Really? I found that surprising. Please explain.
Well, you know, it's sort of a lead-off provocative statement in a lot of the lectures I give on national security, and it's one meant to underscore that when you look at historically where we are in this country today, in terms of facing off against peer group competitors who wish us harm, who are nuclear armed, which was really the situation we were in from the 50s through the 90s, that's gone. And, you know, and then you start talking about the elements of U.S. national power, not military power, but national power in terms of economic capability, the values, the commitment of your population, your openness to new ideas, to innovation. Manufacturing in this country is still at an all-time high, even though we have changed the nature of the workforce. Agriculture in the United States is the envy of the world. Information technology, a lot of lectures start with India's 2 generations ahead of us. That's nonsense. Aviation, and on and on. And so, you know, I tell people that the country is the wealthiest society in the history of mankind. And oh, by the way, another element of national power, which is the armed forces. Your men and women, 2.1 million people in the active Guard and Reserve forces. And they've been in combat now for 19 years. We've had 60,000 killed and wounded. So they're the most experienced, hardened force the country's ever had. The final sort of notion I would offer that, you know, you can go through threats like North Korea, which is considerable, Iran, Russian expansionism, you name it. And so the threats are there, but on a given month, it's highly unlikely that our naval or air forces will run into anyone who's even remotely a peer group competitor. So at the end of the day, the major weaknesses we have, which we can discuss later if you wish, are our shaky alliances, which are being badly damaged, I would argue. And we do have other political challenges. But so safe, secure, optimistic toward the future, yes, I think to all those things.
Well, picking up on one thing you said there, how are we in Seattle safer? Aren't we in the sights of a missile-happy North Korean leader?
Well, look, the good news about North Korea is that it's a criminal regime. It's not ideological. It's not religious. The motivation for Kim Jong-un and his family are to stay in power, to continue to have access to fabulous wealth, to be dominant in an environment where if you make a mistake on management of power, you get killed. So when he wakes up in the morning, he doesn't harbor a jihadist notion. He harbors the notion of how do I stay in power? And therefore, he's unlikely to take on the dominant military power on the face of the earth. To include with nuclear weapons doesn't make any sense. What he is doing, there's no doubt, is trying to create a technical capability to place us at risk. And he's succeeding. He may have as many as 60 nuclear weapons now, and clearly has an intermediate range capability to threaten mostly the U.S. Armed Forces in Japan, but not Seattle, not yet. He will, give him 5-10 years, they'll be there.
That's the time frame then.
Yeah.
I see. So Fareed Zakaria wrote recently in the Washington Post that President Trump's foreign policy is more sort of a collection of impulses rather than a big strategy or a policy, which is why, I at least find intriguing your premise that we're safer. If you're just reacting impulsively, how does that make the country safe, Seattle safe?
Well, I don't want to go down the rat hole of talking about President Trump too far. But I guess what I would say is one of the major damages he's done to U.S. national security is to call into question the foundations of the alliances we have. And by the way, NATO, sort of like a Primer 101, is not a military alliance, it's a political alliance. And most of the time that I've been in and out of NATO, it's been 16 nations. They were much more homogeneous, much more settled on capitalist models and democratic models and rule of law. Now they're up to 28. But Trump has clearly placed at risk the central aspect of NATO, which was essentially we will all come to the defense of anyone attacked. Dealing with South Korea, 600,000 man armed forces, tremendously advanced economy. He has called into question the South Koreans' ability to believe that he'll be there if North Korea threatens them. In Japan, he appeared to suggest openly that Japan should become a nuclear power, which is preposterous. The proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is the most important threat the American people and our allies face. So he has called into question to the Japanese, is he going to withdraw? And finally, I think the Australians are also feeling increasingly isolated, having depended on a tremendous military partnership since World War II. So one of the major damages Mr. Trump has done is to weaken those defensive alliances. They're going to have to be fixed by the next president, one would hope.
So 50 or more Americans, we have learned, service members, sustained traumatic injuries in the aftermath of the U.S. drone strike on Qasem Soleimani. At first, everyone was told everybody's fine, nothing happened. And so the question for me is, are we now covering up information, or is it possible or even likely that the president didn't know that those injuries occurred?
Well, first of all, who knows? The president has a dim relationship with the truth as a matter of habit. I think Secretary Esper, by the way, I have great hopes for. He's a smart guy, an experienced guy.
And do you know him well? Do you know him?
No, not at all. He's struggling to maintain. He owes the President of the United States his loyalty under the law, under the Constitution, and so do the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So they're going to have a difficult role trying to remain an apolitical, responsive force to all legal orders out of the President of the United States. Now, the 60 casualties, it was sort of interesting to me. First of all, I think that night nobody knew exactly.
Well,
nobody
then why say anything? Just be quiet at that point if you...
Nobody did say anything. You can no longer keep a secret more than 8 seconds since we all have cell phones and email accounts. So I think, by and large, the next morning there was a common interest in both the Trump administration and the Iranians to say that this was a carefully targeted symbolic strike. It was anything but that. By the way, those missiles there were two types of missiles they fired. One of them had a 1,900-pound warhead, and the other one a 650-kilogram warhead. They fired more than 20 of them. 4 of them never got close to the target. The one that was fired at Erbil missed by 20 miles. And then a bunch of them impacted. 2 didn't detonate on Al-Assad Air Base. These are giant warheads, for God's sake. So the next morning, I think the Iranians were embarrassed, and they said, fed into the line.
And also, there was a plane crash that was simultaneous.
Well, yeah. But I think Mr. Trump at that point he got scared by Soleimani's funeral. He watched millions of Iranians and Iraqis enraged by the targeting of General Soleimani. And by the way, some very respected people, friends of mine, said, no, Trump did the right thing. He reestablished deterrence. My personal viewpoint is that if there had been a National Security Council meeting with 20 people in the room, which most sensible administrations do, we would have never killed an Iranian Quds Force commander at the international airport in Baghdad. It was ridiculous. And we also nailed the senior Shia militia commander in the same strike. So it was Trump at Mar-a-Lago golfing. Esper and General Milley fly down there and brief him, and he takes the manly option. I actually think that's what happened. Then he watched the reaction, and it scared him half to death. And
so he wanted an out at that point.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
The Iranians wanted an out as well.
I think both sides. A war in the Gulf didn't make any sense for the Iranians at all, nor for the U.S., nor for the region. To include the Saudis and the Israelis, who were going to be the first target of a general conflict in the Gulf.
I want to bring in Chris Daniels from King 5.
The hometown team.
The home team. You may have just stole my question, but is the threat over in your mind with Iran?
No. To my surprise, I've taken part in several U.S. exercises to throttle adversary countries economically, and it never worked too well. You ended up with the general population suffering, but the elites you couldn't get to. Serbia is a good example. In this case, again, somewhat to my surprise, the Obama team got in there and got a UN resolution, which is largely being respected in terms of sanctions on Iran. Now, you can get into deeper and deeper. Was it right to withdraw from the nuclear accord, yes or no? But the Iranians are suffering terribly economically. They've got to break out of the box. They could negotiate their way out. Trump's put them in a position of publicly caving, which they're not going to do, or they can find other ways to try and break out. Russians and Chinese are supporting them, and they're going to strike back at the economic blockade, and that means we're going to be targets. They'll use surrogates to go after us. They'll skate up to the edge. There's no sense to the Iranians to negotiate with Trump. They're hoping he'll be gone in January. So I don't think they're going to be a diplomatic, sensible engagement. So I think we're still at some risk. But the Iranians actually don't want a war. I'm confident of that. U.S. air and naval power would be devastating on both their military and their economic targets. So maybe we'll skate through and finally get back to talking to them. We've got to talk to them, figure out some. And by the way, Iran's an interesting situation. Some nations we face are irrevocable adversaries. You can't get them to turn around. When you look at Iran, the only conflict we have with them is over security issues. We don't want them to have long-range missiles and nukes. We don't want them threatening their other neighbors in the Middle East or Europe or us. But other than that, there's no baked-in reason why Iran and the United States have to be adversaries.
Audience, if you want to ask a question, it'd be good to line up now. We'll run out of time, and I'll bring in Amy Radel from KUOW.
I'm just curious what you think the underlying reasons might be that we're seeing. We keep hearing that we're seeing leaders around the world who have similarities to President Trump in Brazil and the Philippines. And so what's contributing to some kind of similar leadership styles in these other places as well?
Well, you know, I taught political science at college level for years, and I lecture about American government all the time, and I used to know a lot about the U.S. government. I no longer do. So it's difficult to answer that question. I think there's been a generalized feeling of mistrust in the United States and elsewhere toward political elites on the left and the right. And particularly in democracies or pseudo-democracies. We're seeing a failure of democracy throughout Latin America as an example. You know, I've watched this pendulum back and forth now, and when I graduated from West Point, there were 2 democracies in Latin America, and then we got to where there were only 2 that weren't democracies. Now we're going the other way. Democracy didn't deliver either economic opportunity or political freedom necessarily. And so I think in this country, that's part of it. I keep banging on my friends in the Democratic Party saying, you better reach out and try and understand, why do 40% of the people in this country, Catholics, union members, are supporting President Trump? Why is that? Figure it out and try and reach out to that population. The last, that 2016 election, there were 2 authentic candidates according to the general electorate, Bernie Sanders and Trump. And I think we're seeing that in other places also. You get Orkan in Hungary, certainly another example, where you get unrestricted immigration overwhelming relatively poor, newly arrived European Union members, and nobody's doing anything about it. So he came in with an answer. I think this is, we're seeing a lot of this, the failure of democratic values.
One more time, audience, if you want to join, now's the time. I have kind of a Trump rat hole question in the way that you defined it earlier. There's a lot of these tell-all books coming out about the president. A recent one, A Very Stable Genius, by a couple of Washington Post reporters, recalls a moment where President Trump was talking to some of his generals, and he told them they were a bunch of dopes and babies. What does that do to morale, or how do people respond to that? What do you do in a situation like that?
Well, you know, I just finished that book, Phil Rucker and his colleague at the Washington Post, and I had to push myself to read the last third of it.
Why?
It's an exhaustive, detailed analysis of situations in which the President of the United States does sound like a blanking moron. And it's really unsettling, but it goes on and on. So, and by the way, Trump...
Too much information.
Trump actually has a dozen good ideas in the background, but his personal character and his demeanor and his ignorance, and you know, I hate to be so, you know, frank about this, but it's gotten to the point now where there's no surprises. I'm going to never buy another book about Trump. I already know about Trump, and so do the rest of you. So the question now isn't Mr. Trump. The question is the 40% of the people that support him. What is there lacking in our political agenda that would cause good working men and women to support this president? And that's a challenge.
Gallup yesterday had the president's approval the highest it's been in many months. 49%.
Well, it's still the only president, I think, in modern history whose positive ratings have never gone 50% or higher. So, you know, mostly people are disenchanted with him. And the ones that do support him know the problems with truth-telling and boorish behavior, and they say, no, there's something else here that's causing us to continue to support him. We better figure out what it is.
Audience question. Hi. Join us.
Thank you, General. I'd like to switch gears and ask a question that's related to one of the many other hats that you've worn in your career. You are a former drug czar, and the nation is in the midst of an opioid crisis. And while there is a lot of debate about who's responsible for how we got here, I'd love to get your take on where we go from here at a national level and at a city and local level.
Yeah, well, look, I probably spend 40% of my time dealing with some aspect of behavioral health care, primarily in the treatment areas. And you know, look, here's the bottom line. There's 320 million of us who live here, and probably 20 million of us have a substance abuse problem. And it is the dominant rationale behind almost everything you don't like about America. It explains the criminal justice system with over 2 million people behind bars. It explains, you know, falling out of windows drunk at a university. You name it, it's caused. If you go to an emergency room, literally half to 2/3 of the people who come in through the door are there because of alcohol or illegal drug aspects. So it's a huge problem. And by the way, you know, 20 million have the problem. We got 3.5 million in treatment. The only real strategy starts with the prevention and the education of adolescents between the 8th grade and the 12th grade so that they espouse a lifestyle that is not involved in pot, beer, and ecstasy. And if you can get them to age 18, 19, 20, playing sports and getting involved in Girls and Boys Clubs of America, et cetera, then they end up highly unlikely to ever have a drug-related problem. Now, the magnitude of the problem is just unbelievable. The President took a victory lap last night and he said, well, we've already seen the opioid crisis coming off the peak. And it's true. The 2017 stats were 72,000 dead from overdoses. And this last year, the stats are in, it's around 68,000 people dead of overdoses. That's more than the entire Vietnam War killed in action. And by the way, Seattle in the Northwest is one of the many epicenters of this. So we know how to deal with it. And right now, we've got Band-Aids on it. We got 700,000 people on methadone in America as we sit here tonight, 400,000 on buprenorphine, 40,000 on Vivitrol. We saved 25,000 lives last year on opioids with naltrexone emergency response. So we got a huge problem. Prevention is the answer. Prevention and education.
I want to bring in Chris Daniels from King.
You know, there's been a lot of conversation about the southern border of the United States, but we have a border just up the road, as you know, and it's an underreported story just how many people are seeking asylum in Canada and going across the border, people flying in or either leaving the United States and going across the border to Canada. It's a bigger story, frankly, in Quebec than it is in British Columbia, but is there anything for us to be concerned about in your mind here in the United States?
Americans seeking asylum in Canada?
Yes, or Nigerians in particular. The numbers have tripled in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
People from the Far East that have flown in under the two-nation agreement. And it's a huge story in Canada about immigration into Canada from the United States and people seeking asylum. Is there an issue on our border here that's closer to home, given all the attention that's focused on the southern border?
Well, I've been dealing with that border issue now for a better part of 20 years. We got a 5,000-mile border with Canada and around 3,000 miles with Mexico. Fortunately, except for being next door to the Vatican, the Canadians are about the most benign society we could have lucked out into. I tell people they're just like us, except they're not armed.
That's a good line.
Now, Mexico and the Canadians, Canadians, the RCMP are right down the road here, and they're in a joint headquarters watching that border. And it's a problem both ways, but the Canadians ought to be more outraged. We're the drug exporting nation to Canada, although they're sending high-quality pot south, too. So, and the border is loosely controlled. There are places you could drive an 18-wheeler across the border loaded with jihadists with, RPGs on their shoulder, and you have to honorary sign in crossing the border. So we got to figure that out. There was a great argument that we ought to have a basket of external border controls only around Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. I mean, that's not going to happen. Poor Mexico. I tell you, I love Mexico. I spent half my life down there. The language, the culture, the food, the music, the strongest families in the world. Their businesses are honest. If you're an American business dealing with a Mexican and they say they're going to do something, they'll do it. but their government is essentially a corrupt, incompetent mess, and it's getting worse. This year we're in now with AMLO, our new bizarre Mexican president, wonderful man by all accounts, probably not corrupt. 37,000 Mexicans will be murdered, the highest in the history of their recorded information. It is a nightmare. Nobody's safe down there. And so the borders are a real problem. You know, people go on about the wall, and I have friends who just think the wall is like racism and Gestapo combined. The Clinton administration and the following, we got 20% of the border with an obstacle and barrier plan in, and it helped enormously. Of course it did. For God's sake, San Diego and
So I don't want to run out of time.
I mean,
here.
but it was just crazy talk. So there's no rational discourse about borders in this country right now. Mexico is important to us. Canada's our #1 trading partner. Mexico is #2.
Hold that. Amy Radel.
Since you're local these days, I just wondered what you make of, we've had several years now of marijuana legalization here. You mentioned the importance of youth not using. It looks like from what we can tell, youth use of marijuana is not increasing under legalization, but adult use is, and THC figuring into fatal car crashes seems to be increasing. So,
well, you know, my undergraduate degree is basically in engineering, so I always try and get facts, and getting to the facts on a lot of these issues is really tough. Everybody's selectively lying with information. Here's a general statement. And by the way, the Seattle Times is a great newspaper. I did one interview with them when they did that special before the vote on legalization of marijuana. They portrayed my ideas honestly. I told them, that's it. I'm not speaking to the issue anymore. If you want your children and your employees smoking pot, knock yourself out, not me. I think it's a bad healthcare policy. It's going to result in a huge increasing problem. I think it's probably irreversible. And the worst aspect of it was medical marijuana, not even recreational. If it's medical, if smoking dope is medical for pain management, then why would it be inappropriate for your 14-year-old to toke up? So I think we're going down the wrong road. There's a well-organized legalization group in the country that's trying to prevent us from keeping statistics on adolescents. National Institute of Drug Abuse, we tried to get a study going. Let's watch Colorado and Washington adolescents and see how this policy plays out. And they're preventing us from keeping those stats. So it's a stupid policy from almost every aspect. It's now 33 states have either legalized or medical or some aspect of it. I think it's irreversible. We'll see. I don't know. Too bad.
So we have to hold that thought. We have been talking foreign policy and national security with General Barry McCaffrey. We're coming right back with 4 new Seattle City Council members. Stay with us. Thank you. So fast, I didn't get to. With the 4 newest members of the Seattle City Council. Going down the line, we have Alex Pedersen from Seattle's 4th Council District in Northeast Seattle, Dan Strauss from the 6th District, Ballard and the northwestern part of the city, Tammy Morales from my own council district, District 2, the south end of Seattle, and Andrew Lewis, hi Andrew, down there, from Seattle's 7th District, downtown Queen Anne and Magnolia. Hi everyone.
Hello.
Thanks for being here. So I'd like to start with the burning question on a lot of people's minds here in downtown Seattle, and that is, how can we make downtown safer? I'd like to start with you, Councilmember Lewis, because as many of the folks in the audience know, you have a proposal for a police storefront near 3rd and Pine. So 2 questions for you right off the top here. One is, how does a police storefront make the streets actually safer? And what do you do about the staffing problem, which over time is very difficult to maintain?
Yeah, well, Joni, first off, thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to be on the stage for the first time at City Club. Long-time attender of Civic Cocktail, so it's great to be here and share this evening with everybody. And welcome to District 7. We're in District 7 currently, so really excited to be here. Right. So now. you know, I would say this on the storefront proposal that I put out there. First off, to clarify, I'm not proposing explicitly a police storefront. That's the first thing I want to put out there. You know, we've had police storefronts before in the Pike Pine corridor. That intervention alone hasn't worked. You know, looking at Crosscut, David Croman had some good reporting last week that indicated we've had 3,000 additional service hours in the Pike Pine corridor on top of the normal police staffing level. Police presence alone is not going to fix a lot of the systemic issues that are happening in the Pike Pine corridor. What I am proposing is how can we partner with a lot of the organizations that do great work in the city, organizations that I have seen do really impactful upstream work like Choose 180, Community Passageways, that engage with young people, that give young people the tools and opportunity that they need to succeed. Like, what can they do with the opportunities where they can do programming out of a storefront in the Pike Pine corridor? What could Street Bean do, which has pre-apprenticeship programs for young people that are exiting homelessness and need job training and an opportunity to get ahead in the city?
So is it police and these other groups, or is it?
Well, you know, my proposal specifically was community resource officers. And we've got the community resource officer program that's coming online here in February. We're going to have 18 officers by the end of the year. They're trained to de-escalate situations. They're trained to be a resource to make the job of our police officers more impactful. If a police officer who's a sworn officer encounters someone who's in a state of some kind of public health duress, be it substance addiction or behavioral mental health, instead of trying to deal with that call as a sworn officer, they can call in a community service officer, they can clear that call, they can move on to the next response that requires a sworn officer, and the community service officer can de-escalate that person, get them into services, get them into housing. Those are the kinds of interventions that are missing in that corridor, because like right now, you know, this is an ecosystem that has a McDonald's, a check cashing place, and a smoke shop. And we got to introduce some things into this ecosystem that provide different incentives, that provide different services, and that provide activating the space in a way that's going to be conducive to the economic development of downtown, and also provide more options for folks that are at Third and Pine who are commuters, who need services, or any parts in between. That includes being a resource for tourists that are in the area as well. So there's a lot of things we can do with the storefront. I want to have a community conversation with how we program it. And you know, I'm starting the conversation. It's not the end of the conversation, and it's also not the only thing we need to do in Pike Pine. And we're going to have some more recommendations that'll come out over the next few months.
So, Councilmember Morales, as you just heard, there are more police downtown. There have been this year compared to many other years, but this 3rd Avenue bus corridor is a persistent problem. What suggestion do you have for making the place safer?
Well, I agree with Councilmember Lewis. You know, we know that this particular area, this intersection, has already had increased patrol. The emphasis patrols have been there, and I mean, this has been an issue in the downtown area of Seattle for decades.
Very long time. Yeah.
So this isn't a new issue. And so I think what we need to acknowledge is that we have been doing additional service hours. We have been including services for the folks that are living on the streets, but we need to do more to make sure that there are services available for people, and that means having to provide, as Councilmember Lewis was saying, some of the upstream measures. We need more programming for folks. We need more economic opportunity for people. We need more for folks who are living homeless. We need to provide access to mental health services, to drug treatment services, and we need more permanent supportive housing so that we get folks into the kind of stable situation that gives them access to those resources. Without that stability in their lives, you know, we aren't actually addressing the upstream issues that have put them there in the first place.
So I'm going to jump over to you, Councilmember Pedersen, and ask you, do we have a police problem or a prosecutor problem? Two of the suspects collectively have more than 70 arrests.
Well, I think big picture, everybody deserves to feel safe in their neighborhood, and people do not feel safe downtown, and we need to recognize that issue In terms of getting to the bottom of it, it's a combination. I believe we do need more police officers. We had a study back in 2016 calling for 175 more officers. We were not even near that. In terms of when we do have persistent offenders,
175 more total?
We need 175 more according to that report. We're very far from that. And I do believe in going upstream as well. I helped work on the Seattle preschool program, which has great outcomes of getting preschool high quality, keeps people out of the criminal justice system. And to your question about persistent offenders and prosecution, yes, I do believe that there is a problem where we're not prosecuting like we should. We do need to have both city attorney on misdemeanors and the King County prosecutor on felonies to prosecute and to get help for people who need that help, so they're not just released back into the street.
Councilmember Strauss, I'm moving along here now too. Some taxes that are being talked about in our city. One has been called the Amazon tax. It could possibly go before voters. There's also work going on right now in the legislature for a countywide tax on higher earners at businesses throughout the county. Do you have a preference for these? What do you think of these two proposals?
Well, I think a countywide proposal is a way that we don't pit Seattle versus Bellevue, Microsoft versus Amazon, Expedia versus anyone else. You know, when we see tax bases that are broad and are able to incorporate as many people as possible, we see that tax base is more productive, and we don't necessarily have to pit people against each other. You know, I was reading the Crosscut article last night, and CEO of Gravity Payments, Dan Price, was quoted as saying his payment to this tax would be less than the 90s themed holiday party that they recently threw.
Wow.
So, you know.
So it's not significant that the businesses won't fight it that much. Is that what you mean?
It seemed, from my reading of that article, that he was in support of it.
Councilmember Morales, what do you think of the idea of the countywide tax or the one that's being talked about just more narrow for Seattle, although it's a bigger number it has on it?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, what's happening in Olympia, I think it's important to acknowledge a very important first step, which is that our corporate neighbors have acknowledged that they need to help contribute to creating a more equitable way to finance public services in the city and in the county. So I think that's really important. With regard to what has been proposed, you know, it's important that we have a meaningful conversation about what kind of revenue this is going to generate, what kind of services it will be able to provide. And so there is conversation continuing in Olympia about what that looks like. I think for many council members, based on the council briefing we had this Monday at least, I think I can say that we are in agreement that where the conversation in Olympia starts to cross the line is when they start to talk about preemption.
Right. A lot of folks thought that, a lot of folks who were party to the discussions about this thought that preemption was necessary to avoid duplication. In other words, a countywide tax and then a city tax.
I think we need to be careful about that narrative. You know, we are all elected to represent our communities, and that means that we have been entrusted with having those conversations and making the decisions. What I don't think is helpful is, or really meeting our fiduciary responsibility as a city, is to be giving away a potentially important tool for how we are financing public services in the city. So I don't think that the city particularly should be advocating in Olympia for giving away a potential tool like that, particularly when we are, you know, possibly on the cusp of a recession. We all acknowledge that we have a growing homelessness problem and many other issues that we need to be prepared to pay for. So I just think that, you know, the city council needs to be able to tap into to tools like that, and we need to be careful about that conversation.
So if I hear you clearly, you're saying that you don't want the city to be part of a package that says that the city couldn't do something on its own. Is that?
Yeah, I don't think that preemption in Olympia with the bill that's being considered there is something that we need to be talking about.
Amy Radel from KUOW.
I was going to turn to the proposed ban on winter evictions. I think it's coming up for a vote on Monday. And Councilmember Lewis, I was just curious what you think the impact of that ban will be if you approve it, and what kinds of changes might you be proposing and why?
Right. Well, I think the really important thing that we need to aspire to as a council and local governments all over this country is no one should be making it, or no one should be in a position where they're working and not able to make it in this country. And we have a lot of folks that are working 1 job, 2 jobs, 3 jobs. They're not able to make rent. Rent is rising at faster than the pace of earning. And we have a lot of folks that are getting evicted. I think that people that are facing eviction any time of the year need to have access to resources and relief to make sure that that eviction won't happen. We made a lot of progress in the last legislative session in Olympia, where we did have a lot of protections put in where eviction judges can now intercede and have a cure period. They can compel people to enter into a mitigation plan if the amount in controversy is very low. I think that building on those efforts, Councilmember Sawant has put forward this proposal to consider winter evictions. It's modeled after a proposal in France. One of the things that's notable, though, about that proposal in Paris is there are protections in place where landlords are compensated in the event that the eviction is stayed until the spring. One of the amendments I am putting forward is a mitigation fund that will make sure that for that period where the eviction has been stayed, which currently is a November through March period, that during that period there will be a mechanism to make sure that the rent is being paid, that the tenant can provide that support, that possibly that can be the catalyst for the landlord and the tenant to work something out so the eviction does not go into effect in April. And I think we need to use this as an opportunity to facilitate those kind of relationships between landlords, between tenants, and the role that we as a city can use to put resources in to make something like that happen.
Any idea how much the mitigation fund would need to have to fit the need?
Yeah, so we're still looking into that, and the reason it's a complicated question is that we have a lot of other mitigation funds right now, like the home base program, which is a really good example, that's prevented a lot of people from falling into eviction. I want us to be really careful with the amount of money that we're putting into this fund, because I don't want us to be in a position where we're taking from other similarly situated mitigation funds. And this is really going to be designed to be a catch-all if tenants have not been able to get support at any of the other levels before they get to this point where they're facing eviction in the winter. I anticipate it won't be a significant amount compared to those other funds. I don't want to cite a number right now, but we will have a number by Monday when we consider these amendments. That's one of the things that has been a priority for me in pursuing this. And I think that that's just the responsible way to pursue it. We can't have essentially an unfunded mandate in saying we're going to prevent these evictions, but not having resources to compensate the folks it affects. And that's what the Paris ordinance that this is modeled after does that.
Chris Daniels.
So I feel Andrew is getting most of the questions here, so I'll offer this up to the three of you. There's been quite a bit of news downtown just in the last few weeks with businesses leaving downtown, whether it be Macy's, Barnes & Noble, Forever 21. At the same time, the shooting happened, and you already talked about the issues at 3rd and the Pike Pine corridor. So what can the council do to increase the economic development in that area? And also, how would a storefront stop 2 men from indiscriminately shooting, as court documents have shown today?
I'm happy to jump in on this. For 3rd Avenue specifically, there have been a number of proposals about how we can improve just the cityscape of 3rd Avenue. It's now a transit-only street, and it's not functioning correctly. We have buses that have to weave with each other, which creates confusion and it clogs the street. So we have an opportunity to actually change how our street functions.
Does anybody think it shouldn't just be a bus corridor only?
That's how we get the freight of people through the city. And unless we want to be sitting in traffic, I think we need to be relying on buses until we can get light rail built out. And what I've also noticed is, in my previous role working for Councilmember Sally Bagshaw, we worked on the City Hall Park, Prefontaine Place in Fortson Square, understanding how the built environment can create inhospitable places. And so the Prefontaine Fountain is a really great example, which it needs to be, Councilmember Bagshaw would say in her 20 years working there, I don't think she'd ever seen it active, right? And so it really needs to be brought back to life in City Hall Park. It needs to open up the Prefontaine Place right next to Pioneer Square transit station. We need to open up Fortson Square with the Chief Seattle Club opening up their new building. And so these are ways that we can change our built environment to be welcoming and a safe place for everyone in our community.
And I want to respond to the second part of your question. I think we have to be really careful about, while I absolutely agree that we can't condone the sort of violence that we are seeing, and as Councilmember Pedersen said, we all deserve to feel safe in our communities. At the same time, we really need to have a conversation about moving upstream and what is contributing to young people in our city, particularly black and brown people, feeling like these are the only alternatives that they have. I'm going to quibble with what General McCaffrey said about why we have 2 million people in jail across the country. When 1 million of them are black, this is not an opioid problem, this is a racism problem. And we have to be willing to talk about what it means for neighborhoods and districts like mine that have been historically underinvested in, have had schools that don't have, adequate teaching, adequate public facilities for the students. Our young people don't have enough food in their cafeterias. Our neighborhoods don't get the resources that they need. Our housing is subpar. The folks in our community don't have access to job opportunities like they do in other parts of the city. The health disparities in my district are worse than any other part of the city. There's environmental racism happening. So I think there are multiple layers of oppression, historic oppression in our communities. And until we're willing to have a hard conversation about how to fix that, we need to stop talking about putting people in jail for reaching out and trying to address the chronic problems that they have in their families. In my community, we have students from Raider Beach High School who are being arrested for shoplifting food at the Safeway. They're shoplifting food because they are hungry, and we're arresting them and putting them through the criminal justice system, and that's going to stay with them forever.
I'm going to leave it.
So I think it's important that we really talk about what is causing these things and start looking upstream at how to invest in our neighborhoods better.
Real briefly.
Real tight, because I want to move to another topic. So sorry. Real tight, but I want to move to another topic, but go ahead.
Well, just real briefly to build on that too. I agree with everything that Tammy said. Community passageways, because Chris, your question was kind of like how could a storefront or some kind of programming intervention have helped in similar situations to what happened at 3rd and Pine a couple weeks ago. I got to say this, when I was an assistant city attorney, one of the organizations I worked with was Community Passageways. And this is a community building group. They have support circles. I was able to sit in some of them as a prosecutor. They work with young folks who are like late teens, early 20s, so in order to kind of to build support, provide community, give resources to them to put them in a position where they're not in a position where they're going to be on 3rd and Pine with handguns. When we talk about upstream, I think this is an important point, because when we talk about upstream doesn't necessarily mean early learning. Upstream doesn't necessarily mean things that we do 20 years before to shape someone's decisions 20 years later when they're an adult. Upstream can be as immediate as someone who has just entered or is peripheral to the criminal justice system now, and there's organizations doing great work to build community and give them incentives to stay out of situations like the one that happened at 3rd and Pine the other day. So there are organizations that we can work with that are getting really good at this. It's a question of how can we scale it and how can we provide more resources to make it more impactful.
I want to move along here. Councilmember Pedersen, Seattle's Transportation Benefit District expires at the end of this year. So this is the voter-approved measure that pays for supplemental buses. What's the plan on this? I imagine that's a new tax. When and how much?
Yeah, so I'm the new chair of the Transportation and Utilities Committee, and I was really happy to be put in that position because it's about half of the city budget goes through that committee with both utilities and SDOT. And my main priority this year is to give voters a chance to renew the Transportation Benefit District. We want to move the most people in the most environmentally friendly way through our city, and that usually is buses or getting them to Sound Transit stations. So it's complicated this year because of initiative I-976 and which I opposed. That's going to limit our ability to collect car tab funding. So we're hoping that's overturned. In the meantime, we're not going to take any chances. We're going to craft a ballot measure to get on the November ballot to replace this, because it's about 350,000 bus service hours. It's about 90% of our pothole budget. King County's also looking at putting together a measure which would be welcome, because it is a regional transportation system.
Time, remember? They voted no on that
right.
when
So
they had a chance.
We're going to be ready with our own.
Councilmember Strauss, what do you think of no show is complete without a mention of the streetcar? What do you think about the First Avenue streetcar? I mean, the costs keep going up. We have federal investigators looking into that project.
So,
are you a fan? Is it still a great idea?
I have so many thoughts and feelings about it. You know, I have said that we are already 10 years behind. We have grown so quickly. We're 10 years in deficit with the infrastructure that we need to keep up with the growth that we're experiencing. The Seattle that I grew up in is a Seattle that does things halfway, you know, and the streetcar is an example of this.
But yay or nay to the streetcar?
So the streetcar needs, if we're going to keep it, it needs to be connected. It needs to have its own lanes, and it needs to be able to not be stuck in traffic. And so I would like to see the streetcar work.
Well, we have folks looking at SDOT and wondering about a bunch of projects that could affect as also rapid ride. Anybody else on that? Do you think we should proceed with the streetcar? Some of the rest of you.
Clarify the question one more time.
The rest of you.
Well, I'm happy to talk about the Central City Connector. I'm not a fan of that project because of the tremendous capital costs, tremendous operating costs. There is some redundancy where we do have other ways to get from point A to point B down there. As you pointed out, there is a federal investigation. We'll see what the results are of that investigation, and the Transportation Committee will be ready to act on any findings.
It's hard to know how long that goes. I mean, that could go on for some period of time.
Yeah,
yes?
It'll be at least 6 to 12 months.
Mm-hmm. Joni, I'll just answer you directly, which is that I would love to see the streetcar be successful. I would love to see it connect South Lake Union to Yesler Terrace, because there are places that the streetcar connects to that are not currently connected to by a one-stop or no-stop transit. And when we invest in transportation infrastructure, we need to make sure that the transportation gets its own lanes, so it doesn't get stuck in traffic, that it's reliable and easy to use.
Yeah, you mentioned when we talked that you want more bus-only lanes.
I do.
How
so
many?
You can, where we can get, I mean, pretty much, throughout the city, so that you can rely on your bus, go to your bus stop, catch your bus within 10 minutes, and not get stuck in traffic when you're on your way to your destination.
Chris Daniels wants to say something.
I want to say something. Well, it is called Civic Cocktail, and a lot of people in the room are having cocktails, and we've talked a lot about serious stuff. There was a huge controversy last week when it came out that the new NHL franchise could be called the Kraken.
I had to look it up.
Is that the right name for Seattle's new team? Just go down the line.
Undecided.
I don't like it. I don't know what it means, but I don't
I had to
like
look it up. I had to absolutely look it up.
I love octopus, and what I would say is that the Seattle Dragons, I do love the Seattle Dragons.
I'd want to check with the constituents in my district first. That's what I was elected to do.
Amy Riddle.
I just wonder, when you talked about the federal probe, it talks about problems within SDOT with staffing, with the bidding process. Are these things, since you're on the heading the Transportation Committee, are these things that you've observed? Do you have concerns about SDOT process?
I have great confidence in the director of SDOT and have had good experiences with them so far as an elected official trying to serve my constituents. When we look at renewing the Transportation Benefit District, for example, I was at the Move Seattle Levy Oversight Committee meeting last night. I think really we just want to make sure that SDOT is cooperating with the federal authorities. It's the Office of Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Transportation to just make sure they're cooperating. I did actually reach out to the OIG, and there's no sign that anything is that they're not cooperating. So we just need to wait and see what the results are, and then we're going to look and see if we should be doing something to tighten up any sort of oversight and fiscal responsibility.
Councilmember Morales, when you and I met before this, you said that one of the things you want to do as a new city council member is you really want to take steps to help local small business. Can you name for us 2 sort of practical steps that the city council could take to help local small business?
Sure. So, well, I'm sure if you are a small business owner, you know that our state constitution prohibits the ability for us to do a lot. There is a prohibition against gifting public funds, which is why there are so many programs like the new Legacy program, Legacy Business program, that are attempts to be kind of workarounds and support small business. I think one of the things we can do is, particularly for legacy businesses that are at risk of getting pushed out of the city, is to create more community land trust, community ownership of land, so that our businesses can buy commercial condos, for example, where small businesses can own a building and then rent out to other small businesses, but it's theirs. It's an owned asset, so that they're not at risk of getting pushed out by affordable rents. And then affordable rents is another issue. Commercial space needs to be affordable for the businesses that are here. So we're looking at, in my committee, I'm chair of the Community Economic Development Committee, and one of the things we will be looking at is how we can make sure that our small businesses get the support that they need, whether it's technical assistance or to the extent that we can provide access to capital, so that they can expand and grow in the way they need to.
So we're not Iowa. We have the tech down here. We have a question from Twitter, which will be
A question from Twitter, Matthew
by Chris
Combe.
Daniels.
He says, we are in a climate crisis right now. What are your ideas to put Seattle back as a leader on this issue rather than just saying we are a leader?
That's a great question.
Chris.
Well, one of the things that I want to, what I'm introducing actually next week is the first city in the nation. We will look at every piece of legislation through a climate lens. So we will ask, is it going to increase?
All issues, are you saying?
All legislation would look at it through a climate lens. So we'll ask, are we increasing or decreasing carbon emissions? Are we increasing or decreasing our resiliency or adaptation to the climate crisis that we're in? So that's something we can do and put that lens on right away.
We have
30 seconds.
We have to be carbon negative in 10 years. Bus-only lanes is a way that we can use our electric bus fleet to move the freight of people throughout our city and reduce our carbon emissions without a congestion tax. Now, that's another conversation for another day that may work, needs to include equity lens. And when we look at how we move about our city, we need to have a dispersed electrical grid. We need to make bus-only lanes will get us on track.
Thank you.
On the bus.
On track, no less. So we have been talking to the 4 newest members of the Seattle City Council. And I want to thank each of you, Alex Pedersen, Dan Strauss, Tammy Morales, and Andrew Lewis. Thank you so much. Civic Cocktail is coming back in March with State Attorney General Bob Ferguson and Secretary of State Kim Wyman. We will see you then. Good night.